Right. As the average reader who doesn't have like Hamlet stuck in their brain forever. You don't have any more context other than remember me.
I also thought I'd seen Max in Hamlet, so I thought I had that going. Turns out that was not true at all.
Wow, I need to brush up on my Shakespeare. I read that book and I had no idea about that reference. I'm just going to say it on the podcast because I'm like, I will shame myself now.
Let's go beyond the first page. Let's go beyond the first page.
Welcome back, Second Pagers. This is Beyond the First Page podcast with siblings Phoebe, Phil, and Isaac. I'm Phoebe.
I'm Phil.
I'm Isaac.
And this is Club Meeting 59, Hamnet. It is the first book we're discussing in chapter 2 of the podcast, which is new releases that are being released, either to have just been released or about to be released, book to movie adaptations. And today we have a very special guest, Max. He is a friend of Isaac's from Cornell. And Max, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I wanted to ask you, too, if you wouldn't mind sharing with the listeners about your past, particularly at Cornell and undergrad. And you're actually very versed in Shakespeare, so we're so excited to have you on. Would you mind just sharing with the listeners kind of your background and experience with Shakespeare?
Sure. So I majored in performing media art at Cornell, focusing mostly on Shakespeare. And so I was really honored when Isaac asked me to come talk with you all about this book. I hadn't read it, but I did in my junior year take a class called Hamlet the Seminar, where we studied Hamlet for 2 hours every week for 15 weeks. So I brought my original copy from 11 years ago of Hamlet that I used for that class. So I've got it here just in case we need it. But I was just so excited to get to delve back into that world. It's very far from where my professional life is now. And so really excited to see what all of you thought about it and hopefully bring some additional color where I can to both Shakespeare in general and sort of the biography of his life, wherever that's useful.
Yeah, I think that you will be extremely useful because I don't know if you've ever heard Phil's take on Shakespeare in general, but Phil is not a big Shakespeare
I am
lover.
not. I'm a big fan of watching The Lion King instead of reading Hamlet.
I'm so with you, to be honest. I think we've overblown Shakespeare. As someone who studied it, like we overblow like how like great Shakespeare should be for people to experience, and like we sit in classrooms and make people read it off the page when like the work never existed in full written form. So all you're looking at is like editors rebuilding it. Like I had a professor who used to say that I know when I've put on a really good production of a Shakespeare show when at the intermission, the 6-year-olds are telling their parents what's going on.
Yeah.
And that
really
I think
cool.
that's really like how I want to think about Shakespeare.
And
like,
that actually like speaks
and live.
Yeah, that speaks to me too, because I know that this isn't quite the same, but the most I've ever enjoyed Shakespeare was actually during Drunk Shakespeare, if you've ever like done that. And they do the real Macbeth. And I was like, oh, I know what's going on. Like because when you read it in class, when you're popcorn reading to a kid who's like doesn't know how to say haveth, like you're not really getting the bard, right? Like you're getting some type of So that I definitely agree with that. I wish I would have seen it in like plays, but it's definitely had a bad memory of it just reading it. So.
No, I think that's such a common experience that so many people have had around Shakespeare. And I think it's important to think about it within that context that like this random guy has become so famous because the works that he built were great. But then we spent 400 years editing every spelling mistake, building all of the grammar so that the plays themselves are technically perfect, but they're not his work anymore. even if you go back to the folios, even if you go back to the quartos. And so it's just like, it's been edited so much that it's so cool to get to see a reimagining of the edges of his world where there isn't very much evidence and there isn't very much biographical information. But I think, I think that's such a clear and such a valid take on Shakespeare, is like, we put so much value on this one guy who wrote these 36 plays, maybe 37. And like, we don't do a great job of actually making it interesting.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. This is good. I'm glad we got that take right off the bat then. This is good. And excellent. Also like something I had just never thought about. So Max, already I'm so happy that we're having you talk about this with us. Before we jump into any more discussion, I wanted to, although I feel as if we've kind of broken the ice. Usually we do an opener question. We're kind of already in it, but just to go back to get what everyone likes to read about, I wanted to talk about like time period, because that's a huge part, I think, of obviously of Shakespeare. Kind of like you were saying, these have been reiterated over the last 400 years. And it made me think about reading time periods and what time period you liked to read about. And so I will say, and I've said on the podcast before, that like men say that like the Roman Empire is like they think about the Roman Empire all the time. I think women think about the like 19th century, early 1800s of England, which is bizarre because women had no rights then and basically had to like marry. That was their whole purpose, was to marry and have children. But that's my favorite time period to read about. So I'll turn it over to Isaac to share his.
I think mine is like in this time period, but maybe slightly before. I would say like the medieval, like where knights are very prevalent. Sword play is at an all-time high. But that could span a large period of time, because I enjoy the Genghis Khan stories. I enjoy the romanticized, fantastical King Arthur stories, but really anything with knights, that's going to be my favorite time period.
Yeah. What about you, Phil?
Yeah, I'm maybe like 100 to 200 years past Isaac. I think some people have guns. I'll say that. So some like rich people have guns that work sort of well. That's pretty much the exact time period. So it really accentuates how good of a swordsman you are, because if you can beat a guy with a gun, but it's still actually that's reasonable to do that. Whereas like you get too far into the 19th century and you're just like, okay, you would have just shot him.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Phil, what's like, give me an example of a book that you're thinking of with that.
Pretty much every the Powder Mage trilogy. I mean, unfortunately, most of them are fantasy set in that sort of time period.
Interesting. What about you, Max?
I will say, I feel like I'm kind of copying out here. I am with you on the Knights. I'm always there for it, but I spent a lot of time reading old texts and classical literature. And so like I often now escape to the future and try to imagine what is going to be. And so like the world of speculative fiction and science fiction is something that I have really been enjoying, especially over the last little while, whether that's like Ted Chiang or some of that other work. I'm really interested in sort of like present day forward, like what can we imagine? Or even something that was written, 70, 80 years ago that imagines something like today, and how is it the same and how is it different? And yeah.
That stuff scares me a bit, but I like that you shared something a little different than us instead of going back in time forward. But it can be a little bit too on the nose for me, which is frightening, but very entertaining. Cool. Okay, before we get into talking about Hamnet, Isaac, would you just briefly summarize it for the listeners?
Yeah, so I will just start the summary by saying the character William Shakespeare was never actually mentioned in the book by name. So in this book, Tudor or Glover's son and Agnes, who is, I would think, the main character, get married against both their families' kind of wishes. And they end up having 3 kids. Their second pregnancy is twins, Judith and Hamnet. And Hamnet ends up dying of the plague because he makes a deal with death and takes Judith's place. And then the rest of the book is essentially us following these characters as they learn to live with this tragedy that happened to them and happened to Hamnet when he was a child.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Hamlet is written because of his death. Shakespeare in this book says he wrote Hamlet for his son. And so I wanted to actually, Max, because we do like an intro episode and talk a little bit about our initial thoughts and feelings, but I wanted to get your raw initial thoughts and feelings on this book. Maybe like a pro and a con to get us started, because I think your energy is what we need for the podcast right now. So not to put it all on you, but I think hearing what you thought as far as a pro would be very helpful to start the discussion.
Okay, I am a sucker for multiple timelines converging to a single point.
Okay.
And so I love the
take.
structure.
Phoebe hated that.
But I want to hear why you liked it. I want to hear why you liked it. Book club.
I think the conceit of the way that two separate time periods can move together. And I think about some of my favorite films or different, like Christopher Nolan's famous for doing weird things with time. But I think about the ways in which time is manipulated within the novel itself around, like, we get to see all of Anne or Agnes's whole life because of the ways in which she is able to see. And so then that is then sort of expanded upon within we're watching this small moment happen and getting the context outside of it in the same way that she's able to sometimes see outside of time, which I thought was a really cool way to structure the story, and just something that I always love is when the puzzle pieces all fit together for that last moment when it works. I think when it doesn't work, it really is annoying to be jumping back and forth between time. But I really think that all of the pieces, even if you read this book in reverse, you can see how all of the pieces are laid out to set up this final moment and this final cathartic release that tragedies and drama are famous for. Is like, what is that emotional release that you get at the end of a play or the end of a performance that goes all the way back to the ancient Greek tragedies of, like, how do we experience this loss? How do we experience this trauma and then feel some sort of release at the end of it? And so it feels like time is used to great effect here to get us to that cathartic release. And so I really enjoyed that. But I think that's the other side of it, was like, I had to be really focused on, okay, where does this fit into the context of the story? And so, as perhaps a con was, I had to be really focused on where all of the puzzle pieces were fitting together.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that the last sentiment. And I see your point about the timeline. And I usually like a jumping around timeline too, because I think it adds suspense to a story. It didn't for me in this case. And so then it, like you had kind of said, it became confusing to me. But I think you were talking about the cathartic release, which I agree that the timeline and the way it was written built up to that in a better way. And so, yeah, that was an interesting perspective that and I don't know if Isaac or Phil, if you liked that or didn't like it or didn't have a thought on it. I just know that was something that really stuck out to me as a con, which is, it's so funny. Like, just two readers can have such a different perspective.
I don't mind the jumping out of the timeline either, but I think it is so cool to have guests, because in the intro episode, I think Phoebe, Phil, and I were always all kind of in agreement that, like, this was sort of like a little bit of an easy read. And I am now, like, listening to Max and am thinking, like, was I not giving enough effort into this book to, like, work myself to that buildup? And I don't know if that is just, like, differing tastes, because if you have to work yourself to get there, is that right? Or if just, like, if you're not into it, you're not into it. I don't know. But because I kind of describe this as, like, sort of like an easy read, which it doesn't sound like to Max. It was like you had to really concentrate on it. And now I'm like, did I give it enough effort? like I'm thinking like, was I a lazy reader, I guess? Because I didn't mind the timeline, but I just thought that it was like, I didn't mind the timeline jumping around, but I didn't really experience a cinematic, or I can't remember the word you used,
cathartic,
for it. Cool. Whatever, a cathartic release at the end that it seems like maybe you and Phoebe did, Max. So I guess that is my take on it.
You didn't at the end think, like, when she figured out why he wrote Hamlet, like that wasn't a moment of like I assume that's the moment you're talking about, Max, when she's sitting watching his play and she realizes like the father is taking on the son's pain, and like any parent wishes that they could do that for their son. You got that though, like, but it just wasn't
I understood that it wasn't like a revelation for me. I'm like, well,
right,
obviously he did this because the book is called Hamnet, and in the first line they said Hamlet and Hamlet are the same names.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm not sure I got the same catharsis. I think I did. I got like a satisfaction at the end, but it wasn't that the father was taking on the son's pain for me. I think more that she realized that he wasn't exploiting tragedy for monetary gain, right, which I didn't think was that like a
revolutionary.
I mean, that wasn't really a big issue until 3/4 of the way through the book, where she thought that he might be cheating on him. So like, wasn't really like a huge build up there. That was like a very small part of the story where that was happening. I think that it was sad, but a child dying from sickness is sad. I didn't get any heartthrob from her writing. Shakespeare and Agnes had a very interesting relationship. Like that, he was a cool guy, one of the most influential men ever to live. So like, that's a cool setting, but I didn't really get much from her depiction of it.
Max, did the book elicit that for you, or are you more aligned with like, yeah, I could see why it's not as emotional maybe as some other books that you've read?
I think as the average reader, I would not have been as emotionally attached to it. Mm-hmm. But because I spent so much of my young adulthood reading about Shakespeare, the authorship debates about whether or not he existed, right, all of these pieces, I spent so long studying him that like that story has emotional relevance and resonance. And so that final scene, like, you can't, without it getting super cheesy, place a ton of Shakespeare's text in that final scene in a book. Right? Like, I'm not going to read, like, that novel gets really boring really fast if we're just like, we're doing To Be or Not to Be, like in full unedited text. And so I think one of the things that you then lose though is the ways in which that story and that text resonate throughout the book itself. So like, I did pull a quote. There is the last thing that like is said about Hamnet before he passes away. I'm going to pull it up in the book first. Where is that? Sorry, I just need to find the...
No, you take your time.
The final sort of like stanza of Hamnet's life before we move into part 2 is, mm-hmm, and there by the fire, held in the arms of his mother, in the room in which he learned to crawl, to eat, to walk, to speak, Hamnet takes his last breath. He draws it in, lets it out. Then there is silence, stillness, nothing more. And then if you go to Hamlet itself, his last words are, on Fortinbras, he has my dying voice. So tell him with the occurrence more and less, which have solicited, the rest is silence. And so she
that's
echoes
good
Hamlet's
parallelism.
last words,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Like there's ways in which it resonates for me because I know the text of Hamlet pretty well.
Yeah.
And so she weaves moments from the original text itself into, but all you get is 2 words, right? As the average reader who doesn't have like Hamlet stuck in their brain forever, you don't have any more context other than remember me. And so that scene doesn't land in the same way. And a lot of those emotionally poignant moments point back to Hamlet itself. And so sometimes I did find, I will say, that the prose was just prose for prose's sake. And there were references to, I think, different things that just sort of moved through the scene without landing in relation to the source in the text. But I think there were moments where O'Farrell really leaned into like, oh, here is a moment where I'm going to call back to this original text and create an emotionally poignant moment. So like that, the rest is silence, and then there is silence. For me really landed. And similarly, that final scene, understanding the context of the way in which roles are reversed, and we know that Shakespeare would have played old Hamlet in the actual production, and the way in which, you know, Hamlet is Shakespeare's most edited play. You can't, he went back over and over and over again. You can't perform it unedited because it's going to be 6 hours long. Like, it's just like, it's so long. It's so large. He spent so much time on this work to try and make it perfect. And we don't know if that's because it shared the name of his son. Like, there was another play that he would have been in that was another version of this when he was a young man. And maybe that's why Hamlet's named Hamlet. Like there's all of this. We're not sure. But for me, the calling in of that really landed that last scene for me. But I also recognize that I have a special vantage point, similar to like how Shakespeare does, of being able to see the play within the context of the book itself.
Story.
And the story.
I wish I had that context, I will say, now, like, listening to you.
So I like, this is why it is so cool having guests on, because I think my biggest critique, or like my biggest like frustration with this book was that it just seemed like there was so many opportunities to be like very clever and artistic, and perhaps they were so clever and artistic they were just like going over my head because I didn't really know what was going on. So like, I finished this book and I very admittedly like did not read Hamlet to prepare for this. I think I maybe have read Hamlet. I just looked up a summary, kind of got the gist of what's going on. I also thought I'd seen Max in Hamlet, so I thought I had that going. Turns out that was not true at all. So like, very admittedly, like not high level Shakespearean scholar here, but I was like, okay, what if she had written this whereas like Agnes was the Hamlet of the story, avenging the death of the king who was Hamnet, her son, and all these characters had a shadow character kind of. And that to me, like, I think would have been, prior to Max, would have been like way cooler. But now, like, I think I have like slightly more appreciation for it. So I don't know if you, Phoebe and Phil, you guys feel the same way. Phil, you did read it, read Hamlet to prepare for this, but like, I think it just is, I'm kind of like mirror shattering, you know, like if they had like a sound, it'd be like, shh, like, okay, things are like clicking into place for me, for this book. And this is like a me problem, not a book problem, with a lot of problems I had with the book.
I feel like, though, it should read on both levels, you know, like I should get a greater appreciation for it because I spent so much time studying Hamlet and studying Shakespeare in general, but it shouldn't shut you out of having a really emotionally poignant experience because you don't have that context. because then it falls trapped to the same problem that Phil was talking about at the beginning about Shakespeare, around it not being accessible and people not feeling like they have a valid emotional reaction to it. Whereas I think your reaction to this book is so clear and so fair to have that reaction and just be like, it actually didn't land for me in the same way. And like, a truly great story should land for everyone, no matter their context. And maybe we're all taking something different from it, but I don't think that your experience is any less valid than mine, just because I spent all this time studying Shakespeare. Like, yeah, of course it's going to land a little bit harder for me, but like, how does that story also read for you? I think is so important when we think about like the context of how this book and this story lives beyond just people who are nerds about Shakespeare.
Yeah. It's such a good point.
I think like the reason that Shakespeare was all bangers was because he wrote for everyone. And I feel like that's what I'm hearing that like kind of was missing here is like, yes, there's the highbrow, beautiful language and stories about all of these things, but also the plays are full of dick jokes and like comedy and jokes that play to the groundlings, the people on the ground. And it addressed all strata, all levels of people and was enjoyable for all of those people. And I think now we kind of lost that like Shakespeare is full of dick jokes part of the enjoyment of that work because the language is so abstracted from where we are, and everyone's you imagine Shakespearean actors speaking in this like high British received pronunciation when the reality is the original Shakespearean accent a lot closer to like Louisiana Southern American accent than it is to the modern received pronunciation. And so like there is this image that we've created that like Shakespeare was only for the upper class and for the highbrow. And I think this book kind of plays into that in some ways, when really the plays were, the reason they were so popular was because they were for everyone and everyone got something out of that story, no matter who you were, no matter what your education level was. And I think that's a valid criticism of this book in that like I was able to glean a lot out of this because I have a great appreciation for the original text of Hamlet and the biography of Shakespeare and all of Shakespeare's works in general, but it shouldn't shut people out from the experience and make it exclusive.
Yeah, completely agree, Max. That's such a good point.
Max, as a Shakespearean scholar, did you know about Hamnet and like his son's like the death of the son and like this, they have the same name and all that? Because doing just a little bit of research afterwards, it seems like she had a pretty like that was known, but then everything else, like she had a pretty broad literary license to like kind of say whatever she wanted.
Yeah. There's one historical reference to Anne Hathaway being known as Agnes Hathaway or Agnes Hathaway. And yes, Hamlet and Hamnet were written the same way, but I think Shakespeare's sister actually was not named Eliza, was actually also named Joan.
Right.
And I think O'Farrell changed the name so it wasn't like there were like 12 Joans running around. But Anne and his sister Anne, who passed away, did have the same name. And so it is something that we discussed. I wouldn't say we spent a ton of time around the biographical details, other than just knowing, the classic Stratford upon Avon and the resonance that might be there from losing an 11-year-old son and then writing a story with his name as the namesake. But it was already a story that was being told. A lot of Shakespeare's works, although we present them as new, were often just reimaginings of stories that people had already told. So it wasn't the story itself that people were seeing for the first time. It was his spin, his take on it. Much in the way that we think about, like, if you think about like jazz standards, it was almost a similar thing in Elizabethan England, where it was like there was a prototype of a story and everyone would do their version of it because a lot of people were illiterate and people were still in that oral tradition. And so having a story that people were familiar with and knew the beats of, but maybe was a little bit different every time, was a way to give people more cultural context around a play that was happening.
That's a good tidbit.
Okay, cool. Yeah, very interesting. Phil, you said you liked Shakespeare more after this. I was hoping you could maybe expand upon that a little bit. You said like Shakespeare, and this was in our overview episode for listeners. Like Shakespeare as a person. That was just like kind of interesting because I feel like he didn't come off too well in this story. And I was like, kind of one of my disappointments of this book was like when I heard about it, I thought this was going to be Shakespeare was going to have a lot more influence, or like screen time or page time, I guess. And the fact that he was never even called, like you were just led to allude that that's who it was, frustrated me, like we kind of talked about. But then you just said in our overview, Phil, that you were going to expand on why you liked him more now.
Yeah. Well, first of all, have you ever seen a picture of Shakespeare? He looks a bit grungy. He's a bit like Johnny Depp-esque. Like, I mean, he was building from a very low platform in my mind. I think that I had read a lot about how it wasn't Oliver Cromwell. Max probably knows about how there's like a theory that a royal guy wrote. There's a ton of theories, but one of the most prominent one is that a member of the royal family wrote it because like playwriting was not supposed to be done by the royalty. And so I was going into it with a little bit of just like, okay, it probably wasn't even him. I think the background makes it make a little bit more sense. I think that I read him as to quote Taylor Swift, like a genuine tortured poet. And you can see that coming across. I mean, he was like in this story, at least like abused by his dad, suffered from depression. I mean, he then like married sort of the village outcast as well. And I think that Maggie O'Farrell does this weird sidestepping thing around his infidelities. I don't know. Like I feel like it's not as clear as it could be whether or not he actually cheated on her. But did anyone else feel that way?
I had a note. I'm like, was he like, did he commit adultery?
Yeah.
He did write sonnets about 3 different people. So,
So yes, like historically, but it was also weird that the only validation that we really got was like her witch senses seeing other women on him, which was like it would have been a little bit more straightforward if he would have come out and said it. But anyway, so I mean, I'm not arguing that he was like the best man ever, but I think he was much more interesting and he became more of a person. I think that I gave a little more chance to the writing as well, slowed it down a little bit. I think it's meant to be a play. I don't know why we read it, and like I don't really know why we read plays too much, but I think that it's sort of like poetry, right? Like getting someone to read Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven to you in that like perfect rhythm, like that's exceptional. Reading The Raven by yourself, it's gonna be like, what the fuck is this guy talking about?
Even Max
so it's like really
that sentence was like so much better than
right. And I mean, it's like when Sydney read her poetry to us. Like it's just there's a way that art should be performed, and there's a reason that art galleries are displayed in a certain way, and like someone has to curate that. That is a thing. And so I think perhaps I didn't appreciate Shakespeare as much because I was reading it in the wrong medium. And I think that this gave me that sort of idea to give it another chance. So does that answer your question, Isaac?
Yeah, I think that was very eloquently said. Nice job.
And I think you also really cool. drove home Max's point that he made about Shakespeare in general, about the performance aspect. Like that's my takeaway.
Yeah, it's a performer.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, which is cool.
Yeah. Before we go into our ratings and recommendations, Max, I wanted to pick your brain about any other thoughts that you had that you wanted to share with us, if any.
Oh, hold on. Something poked my brain in something that Phil was saying. It was very interesting that Maggie O'Farrell really shaped this narrative around Shakespeare, whose voice we have heard in so many plays and poems, not really having a voice. Like if you notice, if you go back, a lot of the text is just in the prose, whereas other characters will get quotation marks. Oftentimes, the Glover's son, the tutor, doesn't get it, and we just see his actions, which I thought was really interesting. In addition to sort of like placing this narrative squarely around the mind and words of Agnes, to also take this person whose words echo throughout the canon of Western literature in terms of from Moby Dick beyond to the present day to all of the adaptations that we've seen of different, the Sydney Sweeney, Glenn Powell film that just came out like 2 years ago, right? Like he is everywhere. His voice is everywhere. And to remove that voice and have it be about his actions, I thought was a really interesting choice from a literary and sort of dramatic perspective that I quite enjoyed.
Nice.
I didn't even pick that up, so I like that you pointed that out to our listeners.
Yeah, that was frustrating for me, but like because then I was like, I thought this book was going to be like have Shakespeare in it.
But that feels like the easy out, right?
Yeah.
That it's like Shakespeare has all the answers, he has all the words,
Yeah.
And so to build a narrative around him kind of being a bumbling oaf sometimes and not really having the words, and then other people's hearing him just keep talking and words coming out and just not having it in the beautiful way that we're used to hearing about Shakespeare, I think did a lot of humanizing of this figure that we see and put on a pedestal a lot of the time.
Yeah, for sure. I will just say before we go into ratings, I think this was a much better discussion than we had in the intro. Max, you provided such a better lens for us and our listeners, I think, to view this book from. And I almost wish we had you on the intros because I think more people would read Hamnet if they got your perspective before.
We did this one a little dirty on the intro, I think.
Yes. So maybe we'll give that as a disclaimer on the intro. And I think people could still, the story is known, right? So like people could still fully read this book after listening to this podcast. And I think they would be happier that they had listened beforehand. So I think we can still save it here with that. But I think for rating's sake, I will give it 3. I think it was a weak 3 before, and now it is a strong 3 for me after talking to Max. And I'll pass it over to you, Isaac.
Yeah, I think Phoebe summed it up pretty well for me. Matt, amazing having Max on. Really changed, I think, how this would have gone without him. So always a plus. I think once again, like a reason to read and discuss with people. If it's not on this book club, we hope it is, but do it with somebody because you're gonna be a better person because of it. And I think after this conversation, I have improved my knowledge and like learning and reading ability from this book. However, a 3 kind of with all my negatives. I don't think this sort of like Max and Phil said, a book shouldn't require that kind of background knowledge and like dissection to still speak to you at some point. And it just sort of either went over my head or just wasn't my cup of tea.
Yeah, for sure. Max, what about you?
I think I will be honest, I was ready to dunk on this book before I started reading it. I was like, this is like such a like gimmick. And I think I was more pleasantly surprised than I thought I was going to be by the ways in which some things that I really loved were woven throughout. But I will say that I didn't expect to have an emotional gut punch. And then I found that the final moments of this book really delivered for me personally. But I also, I think as we talked about earlier, recognize that is not necessarily the context that every reader is going to have. But I definitely was crying at the end of this book. And so I feel like by tier meter alone, I have to give it at least a 4.
Yeah.
Good.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Phil, what about you?
I don't need to be as long-winded. I think a 2. It was fine. It didn't hit for me. But I appreciate it. And I am very excited to see the movie. I am too.
I know I considered going actually today before we started recording, but I didn't have enough time.
And I don't know if we said it on the intro, but the movie won a Golden Globe for Best Drama and a Golden Globe for Best Actress.
So, yeah.
And really cool to see someone who was intimidated by Shakespeare and intimidated to take this story on end up co-writing with the author an adaptation of this book that has been so successful.
Wait, who is that?
And I think that's Chloe Zhao, the director.
Okay.
Was very intimidated by Shakespeare originally, and she rewrote the novel into screenplay form alongside Maggie O'Farrell.
Cool.
And then I have not seen the film yet, but I'm excited to sort of see where some of those resonances that we were talking about that maybe weren't able to come through in novel form because it was just the media was too close. Maybe it will be able to address some of those concerns that Isaac had around not actually getting to hear and see the words of Shakespeare in the same way.
Cool. Yeah, I'm very excited to see that movie. I think if you liked Hamnet, you should read Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. For me, it had a very similar cadence and vibe and tone to the writing. But I think if you're looking for a different adaptation that you don't need any context to, this really reminded me of as you were talking, Max, the David Copperfield versus Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. I've recommended it so many times in the podcast, so I'll keep it short. But you didn't need any context of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens to read Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And I think that kind of hit the nail on the head as far as like what we were talking about earlier as maybe a better adaptation. So those would be mine. Phil, what about you?
I think that one that I would do is probably the Kristen Hanna, The Women that we read. If you do like this, I think that is going to be very in tune. I do think a very good book that for some reason is just giving me the same vibes where it is sort of a modern retelling. This isn't a modern retelling at all, but the one I'm going to recommend is a modern retelling of The Marriage Plot is called The Marriage Plot by Jeffrey Eugenides. I think he won the Pulitzer in 2011. And I think that was a very good and interesting sort of take on love and what that has meant to literature in the past. So
cool. Thanks, Phil. Isaac, what about you?
Yeah, I said the Night Watch by Jane Ann Phillips. We read it last year for the podcast. Again,
for sure.
Just it's kind of the same vibe, same like reading vibe.
Yeah. And Max, last but not least.
I'm going a bit of a different direction. If you were interested in the references to Shakespeare and the way that it can exist in a new medium, I think my thought was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, which infuses Shakespeare in a very different way and is set sort of in the early 90s to 2000s and is about Shakespeare and ethics and video games and is a very different style of writing, but I think similarly infuses Shakespeare in interesting ways. And the title is a reference to Macbeth. So there's also that.
Wow, I need to brush up on my Shakespeare. I read that book and I had no idea about that reference. I'm just going to say it on the podcast because I'm like, I will shame myself now. I will have to look up after like what that is. That's very interesting for our listeners as a tidbit. Thank you so much, Max. Always really quickly before we go, we talk about what we're reading next time. As you all know, we're reading Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And Isaac, would you just give us a quick summary of that before we go?
Yeah, so Wuthering Heights is a story of the intertwining fates of the Earnshaw and Linton families. And it's really around the love affair of Catherine and Heathcliff, who's this adopted boy that is a ward of Catherine's father when they are children and is really her first love. But then she spurns him, and kind of his revenge is the story of this book.
Yeah, and obviously a very popular book. So excited to discuss next time with you guys. And I will just say again, Max, thank you so much for being on the podcast. You lent a perspective that we really needed. So again, really just appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so wonderful. I had such a great time. And yeah, just thank you so much.
Awesome. I'm glad you enjoyed yourself. Yeah, this is a bi-weekly reminder to call someone that you love, tell them that you love them, tell them about a good book. Hopefully it's Hamnet. And until we talk again, stay classy, second pagers. We'll see you later.
Yeah, bye guys. Thanks, Max.
Yeah, we'll see you guys. Max, thanks a ton. It was awesome.
Let's go beyond the first page.